Look, here is the breaking news. Everybody is talking about the crisis in Venezuela. After Mr. Maduro was sworn in for a second term earlier this month, U.S. President Donald Trump said he recognizes the Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaido as interim president, coinciding with a number of South American nations. This week, President Maduro announced ceasing ties with the U.S. and demanded the U.S. diplomats to leave within 72 hours. But the demand was rejected by the White House. Why do we see two politicians assuming leadership at the same time? Who will stay as the president in the years to come? And how will the chaos in Venezuela be ended? To look at what is going on in Venezuela, I'm happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Victor Gao-Zhikai, Vice President of Center for China and Globalization, Anna Tangen, our current affairs commentator, and via the internet, we're going to talk to Dr. Wenran Jiang, who is sitting in Vancouver. He's also an adjunct professor in the University of British Columbia. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Victor, what do you make of the official statement by the spokesperson of the Chinese Foreign Ministry regarding the latest development in Venezuela?
I think Madam Hua of the Chinese Foreign Ministry said the right thing. That is, all the countries involved need to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Venezuela and respect the decisions already made by the Venezuelan people through their election process. Therefore, I think we need to avoid interfering in the domestic affairs of Venezuela and avoid putting pressure on one party versus other in the ongoing saga in Venezuela.
So, Anna, what do you make of the fate of American diplomats in Venezuela, because they are demanded to leave within 72 hours?
Well, this is a very interesting formula, because what you have here is apparently the White House has said that if you try to remove them by force, this will be seen, there will be consequences, and that could mean U.S. involvement. They said that everything is on the table. So I think Maduro will be very, very careful and cautious about actually sending troops in to, physically evict these diplomats if they don't leave in the 72 hours. But it's going to lead to a standoff.
Wenran, why did Canadian government show its support and stand behind the White House in support of the opposition leader, who claims to be the president of Venezuela?
Oh, well, the Canadian position has been actually quite known for a long time. This is not a decision made today or yesterday. Last year when the election was held, much of the advanced industrialized countries led by the United States and Canada joining it, not seeing the election of Maduro on this term was legitimate, and therefore they've been holding off. And now with the new development, they decided to jump in to basically say it's time to change. So Canadian position, together with a bunch of other Latin American countries, has been consistent. It's just not following the United States. The Lima Group, about 17 countries, formed 2 years ago to deal with the Venezuela situation. 14 of them has acknowledged the alternative self-proclaimed National Assembly leader who proclaimed himself as president.
Do you believe any military intervention from the U.S. or industrial nations will help further divide Latin America, with one group taking side with Venezuela, such as Cuba, Mexico, Bolivia? The other group, of course, stands firmly behind the United States. How serious is that situation? Do you think we're going to see a repeat of the Maduro doctrine?
Well, first of all, I think the situation in Venezuela is at a tipping point, and if it is not handled properly by the people and the relevant parties in Venezuela, and also if it is not handled properly by all the other countries who are eager to intervene in the domestic affairs of Venezuela, civil war may break out in Venezuela, and the country may plunge into political turmoil and self-destruction. And this will happen in addition to the tremendous amount of economic crisis and the pain that the people in Venezuela have already gone through. Therefore, I think people need to come to senses in Venezuela, and I think order need to be restored and the due process need to be established, and foreign countries need to back off rather than really picking and choosing as if they are choosing their own leader in their on country.
Hey, come on, Victor, given the bitter lessons that we drew from the chaos in Libya following the Arab Revolution, we have a formidable presence of business stakes in Venezuela of up to 50 to 60 billion US dollars. And many Chinese are talking about what would be done to protect the Chinese business stakes. Are we encouraging the escalation of the anarchical situation, or China would prefer to step in some kind of a manner to minimize the negative impact upon the Chinese stakes in Venezuela?
Well, of course, in economic terms, there is a lot of exchange and investment, for example, from China in Venezuela. The economic stake is very high. Indeed, that is the case. However, I think China as a country and the Chinese government in general will firmly stick to the non-interference principle. That means whatever its economic stakes are involved in Venezuela, the Chinese government will decide not to interfere in the domestic affairs.
What if a civil war were to break out, and do you think similar stories would occur, like in Libya, where we have to evacuate hundreds of Chinese personnel from a battlefield ravaged by the civil strife?
It may happen if civil war is breaking out and civil stability is lost. Lots of pain will happen not only to the people in Venezuela but also to the Chinese investments, Chinese expatriates living in Venezuela. But that doesn't give the Chinese government any reason to deviate from its policy of non-interference in Venezuela's domestic affairs.
Even at the height of the Cold War and during the Cultural Revolution, the late Premier Zhou Enlai said we should be able to combine the highest principle with the biggest flexibility. In that case, Anna, do you think China should do some kind of a preventive diplomacy to minimize the impact upon the Chinese business stakes in Venezuela, to sort of subtly and quietly change our traditional line of non-interference? Because we have had those bitter lessons of Libya.
Mm-hmm. Well, quite frankly, I mean, the response by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was not that strong. They did not mention Maduro by name. I think there's a recognition generally that Venezuela is a failed state. You have millions of people leaving, and it is a big headache for China. You have 500,000 Chinese there. You have $50 to $60 billion in investment, and most of it was oil for money. And these projects were supposed to be done. Most of these projects have failed. And in fact, in 2016, China stopped lending money to Venezuela because they had basically, done themselves in terms of their maintenance and capital in terms of the oil. It was just incredibly hard to see how they were going to get out of this. And I think China has been talking to all sides to make sure that at some point, if there is a return to normalcy, that they will not be pushed out.
Wen Ran, what do you think of the end game regarding China's stakes in Venezuela?
Well, China is basically stuck in the country and continuing to support the current government. But, as in the case of, say, Myanmar, you could have a regime change, but relations with China may continue to deepen. And in this case, there will be a lot of dependency on Chinese continuous lending. China has not, in fact, stopped lending money to Venezuela. Just last year, when Maduro was visiting Beijing, China committed about $5 billion additional lending throughout 2019 to further pump up the Venezuela economy. So if Guaido, he claims himself to be the interim president and then committed to have a peaceful election, and afterwards, if Maduro is gone, I think China can continue to do business with Venezuela.
Of course,
I apologize. I meant construction lending, project lending was over in 2016, but there was a fiscal monetary situation which they were addressing with that $5 billion.
Yes, indeed. There should be a consistency of policies or whatever regime change in young democracies such as Sri Lanka where our investment in Hambantota port would have to be guaranteed through legal contracts one way or another. We can raise a number of examples to illustrate China's concerns for our global stakes with the precondition of non-interference. Having said this, let's take a closer look at why we have had this ugly and nasty scenario in Venezuela that becomes front page stories every day, every passing day. What was it that prompted the political situation in this country to have this nosedive?
Well, I was in Venezuela visiting there only once, but the country is very richly endowed in natural resources. But now it is going through very, very difficult economic plight, and there is huge demand for infrastructure investments. I think from the Chinese perspective, we started with all the good intention to help the people in Venezuela to develop their natural resources, to build up their infrastructure, and sometimes government decisions may or may not be the best working decisions, and the country is in economic crisis. And I think in this sense, it is regrettable that Venezuela, despite of all its natural endowments, ended up in such an economic plight. Something needs to be done in terms of reform, for example, restructuring, but that should be purely domestic affairs of the Venezuelan people. And the Chinese side will avoid, by all means, interfering on the political side of the equation. However, as a rule of thumb, China is very accustomed to deal with whichever leader eventually who comes out to lead the country after the due process in any particular country. And this is why China says foreign countries should avoid poking their fingers in Venezuela. And many countries, including the United States, for example, is very much interfering in the domestic affairs of Venezuela.
That's very good from from a slogan's point of view. But let's talk about the real issues here, which was they had a huge differential between where the rich were and the poor were, the very, very small middle class. As a result, Hugo Chavez was voted in on a populist candidacy. He said he was going to return the money to the people. At that point, Venezuela was doing very well. There was a lot of money from its oil. But when he came in, he was not necessarily the most expert at government. He gave away a lot of money. Unfortunately, he did not keep the oil fields going. He did not feed the golden goose that was laying the golden eggs. And as a result, production in Venezuela started going down, and they had to turn to other groups. Also, ideology played a role in this. He took a very firm stance against the United States, against capitalism, and he was a Bolivarist. This is named after a former revolutionary who was advocating a change back to Latin American roots and away from the United States and towards a more communist socialist type of reality. So, the failure of having a middle class did not stabilize this thing. Bringing a group of people into power who were not familiar with how to run a government. I mean, that might sound familiar to people in the United States right now as they look at Donald Trump. But the timing is a little bit strange. I mean, right now, Donald Trump is beset with problems, and all of a sudden, this comes out of the hat. Obviously, this young man, 35 years old, who has declared himself president, must have had some sort of recognition that all of these countries were going to step into line to support him. And it's just strange in terms of this, as I say, the timing.
Weiran, why do you think President Donald Trump decided to align himself with the opposition leader in Venezuela? Is that part of an effort to divert attention from domestic woes to external issues, such as escalation of tensions between the two political forces in Venezuela, and he can easily find other sources to help him work out of the domestic political scandals or bipartisan wrangling? Do you think this logic works?
Mm-hmm. Actually, President Trump and the U.S. policy towards Venezuela has also been quite vocal and has been for a while putting more sanctions, squeezing the Venezuela elites and the Maduro circles. In this case, Canada joined in, sanctioning individuals, up to 70 people in the top circles. So the United States has been doing this for quite a while, except it is now in the crisis point that they're making it a lot more vocal and saying all the options are on the table. Is it for domestic reasons? You can say that because he's also fighting a trade war with China. But it is, if you look at the State Department policy of the United States, they have been trying to deal with the Venezuela crisis for a while. So despite the threat from the United States and other countries, Canada, Venezuela, I agree with our colleagues here, is really a failed state. In the political science and development terms, this is a country rich in resources, but has suffered a resource curse. I've been to the country for multiple times, dealing with the energy sector, talking to, PDVSA, which is a state oil company. Despite tens of billions of dollars Chinese pouring in, the production level is going down, and every year they're returning their payment through oil to China is failing. But at the same time, the Americans also tread very carefully. They have not sanctioned on the oil embargo until now. They're talking about it because they're still buying about 500,000 barrels of oil from Venezuela on a daily basis. And of course, the other buyer is China in the terms of payments of loans. I think they will be careful to not make a mess in Venezuela like Libya, because this is a major, OPEC country. Even the current level of production is down to something like 1.5 million barrels, maybe 1/3 of the level from several years ago. The shock for the global oil market would be quite substantial if it's messing up things there.
So, what do you think of the reasons behind the U.S. Reluctance to impose economic sanctions against Venezuela, other than the fact that the U.S. imports at least half of the oil exports of oil products from Venezuela? China is yet another major partner. Do you think, Wen said the United States has not figured out how to deal with the current crisis in terms of economic sanctions or not?
No, I would say for many years the United States has not liked Venezuela under President Chavez and under President Maduro for many, many reasons, I would say, mostly politically driven. And the United States does not feel comfortable having a major country in South America which is very peculiarly against the U.S. hegemony, for example, and strikes out on its own in doing many things in very extraordinary ways. The United States, ever since President Monroe, has viewed countries south of its border as the backyard, and insisted for many decades that European countries, or in a general sense now, other major countries in other parts of the world, should refrain from interfering in the affairs in Latin America. But Venezuela for many years has been very different. And I would say the U.S. dislike of Venezuela as a country, as a political system, is the main reason why the United States is doing all it can to interfere in the relations for all these years.
It goes both ways. I mean, there was a lot of antagonism coming from Chavez and also from his predecessor. This was not simply, there was an antagonistic relationship. The reason that the U.S. didn't pull their support and sanctions is they get about 7% of the imported oil from Venezuela. And it's a very, very nice light crude, which is very suitable for mixing in with other things. But right now, gasoline is plentiful, and it's quite easy for the U.S. to forego that. There's producing a lot of this fracking oil and things like that. The U.S. is now the largest producer in the world. They're looking at even selling more to China and things like this. So on that basis, this, as I said, the timing is curious. It's a very good move for the United States at this point. They'll have another, be able to satisfy things domestically, and it takes a lot of attention away from other things in Washington.
Wen Ran, here is another major issue concerning what you call the resource curse. Look at Saudi Arabia. It's not a democracy in the Western sense. However, it becomes so prosperous for decades since the discovery of oil-rich resources in this kingdom in the Middle East. Venezuela is supposed to be a democracy, and yet it became so poor. Russia, it may not be called a democracy from the American perspective, but the president is elected into office. Does it also suffer resource curse? I'm so much interested in your use of this phrase.
Well, in the case of these three countries you talked about, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and you can go on to say Nigeria and other major oil-producing states, the common feature about a petro-state, or if they have a particular resource curse, in this case producing oil and gas, that means 70% and above of their oil revenue are coming from the export of these resources. And in the Venezuela case, 95% of the country's export is simply oil. And therefore, but there are different political systems. You know, in Saudi Arabia, it has basically an autocracy and combined with a system that family rule. Venezuela very featured in Latin American historical politics of left versus right, the rich versus poor, and therefore you've got some very radical socialist or populist ideas and revolutions, and that's how Hugo Chavez managed to come to power back in the late 1990s through some kind of combination of coup d'etat and populism. And that state continued to fail because they couldn't deliver. And so therefore, what I look at these states, especially in the Venezuela case, we're observing a situation, it potentially could be very explosive. If Americans intervene, for example, to a certain extent, with Russia, I mean, Victor made the case repeatedly here, saying China would not intervene, but Russia has sent in some kind of airplanes to Venezuela. Would Russia stand by? Another exception, Mexico now elected a new left-leaning president. It has broke with the pact by not recognizing, you know, the new alternative Guaido presidency, and therefore what Mexico is going to look like in the next development is also interesting.
Let's look at what had happened during the years of President Obama. One of the first things he did was to visit the country that hosted the Summit of Americas, and he came across as humble, and he was very apologetic for the mistakes that the United States made during the Cold War, and he was laughed at by Hugo Chavez at the ceremony. Hugo Chavez gave him a book about Bolivarianism, the nationalism issue in this continent. So, do you believe there's going to be the Monroe Doctrine, Wenran, with the military intervention looming larger and larger, with the Latin American continent being divided between the left and the right, between the pro-US and the pro-Venezuela? Shall we have this repeat of Monroe Doctrine?
Well, the historical territorial, you know, sphere influence by the Americans, you know, foreign policy to dominate that part of the sphere has been clear. But in recent decades, in the 20th century, since second half especially, there has been clear resistance. There are a lot of left-leaning Latin American governments are refusing to have American interference. The memory for many people is very short. We should go back not so long in 1960s and 1970s. Under Henry Kissinger, US CIA has done coup d'etats and assassinations throughout, you know, in Chile and other places, doing all these kind of things. And now these memories are still in the place, and therefore we see not all the countries are following the US Monroe Doctrine or leadership or whatever you call it. They're breaking away. And therefore this Venezuela case in the next coming weeks will test. And we have not discussed a key element in who decides things other than foreign forces. That is where the military of Venezuela will be is quite unclear, because traditionally, since 18th century, late 18th century, military called the shots in Latin American politics. And in this case, Hugo Chavez, Maduro, they can sustain their power simply because the military is still supporting them. And I'm not sure now it is the case.
Well,
yes.
I would disagree with that. I mean, Chavez went through the military, and he basically instituted a purge and made sure that only loyalists to him and his government were there. There was quite a period of time when he did that. So yeah, I think they're mostly in favor of his, as is the general, who we're expecting to say something shortly.
But I agree with you. You're right. But Chavez is part of the military. Maduro is not, and he was firmly in charge at the Chavez times. But now Maduro is not succeeding. If you look at the country, when I was there, I got a huge bag of the local currency, and then I said, how much it worth? They said, less than $200. That's like a backpack of money.
Are you telling
now,
a story about
Zimbabwe
free fall in value of the local currency?
1 million percent inflation rate.
That's a joke. That's a very bad joke. It reminds us of what happened prior to the end of the 3-year civil war in 1949. Victor, since William put his finger on our memories about the Cold War, a lot of ugly memories that came back. For example, assassination of President Allende of Chile, who was replaced by Pinochet, the dictator, despite the economic prosperity that ensued, that took place later on. What do you think of the anti-American sentiments in Latin America?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is, I believe the Monroe Doctrine is gone. It's
Joseph Biden, the former vice president of the Obama government, said the Monroe Doctrine was over.
Yeah, Monroe Doctrine is
Yet President Donald
over.
Trump adopted anything but Obama policy regarding many issues in the world.
Monroe Doctrine is dead, and it's not coming back. Now, the United States may still want to impose its will on Latin American countries, but the resistance against U.S. dominance is deeply rooted. There are pro-American forces, of course, in many Latin American countries. American influence is deeply entrenched. But any political leader, I would say, in any Latin American country who wants to really bring in the U.S. influence as if it's the anchor of the political system in the United States, maybe he will invite fire to his own home. So I would say many Latin American countries, including whatever that may happen once the dust settles in Venezuela, they may want to strike out on their own. They may want to have peace and stability rather than complete reliance on U.S. dominance.
It would have been much better had the organizations at the OAS, Organization of South American States, had done this through consensus, through their own things, and the U.S. had stayed out of this. This is not really a U.S. issue. It is really not a Russian issue or a Chinese issue. This is a regional issue involving a failed state. Now, this is having repercussions on the states around it. There are huge flows of refugees who are flowing in every direction, just trying to find food, medicine, and some way of sustaining themselves. So we can't say that they don't have a right, but this issue about why large nations are weighing in on this, especially the United States, is, as I said, very curious. Yes, it's very consistent with their policies, but at this point in time, with Brexit looming, with in the streets of Paris you have riots. There are so many things going on. The last thing the world needed was another flashpoint.
What happened after the devastating earthquake in Haiti was that China sent in anti-riot police to deliberately avoid being seen as part of the political intervention, if not a military one, because we were clearly aware of the Monroe Doctrine. With that, we come to the end of this discussion about the latest crisis in Venezuela. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.